All right, in week 4, we finally wrapped up chapter 3 and moved on to chapter 4. So let's do a quick review. In the second half of chapter 3, we talked about the difference between cultural universals and cultural variations. We talked about the fact that every culture, regardless of that culture, had some similarities, such as cooking rituals, food taboos, funeral rites, music, language, all of that kind of stuff. Now, regardless of the things we have in common, how we go about those rituals can be different, and that's where the variations come in. So, while we may all have great food celebrations to commemorate maybe national holidays or feelings of community, what we eat during those celebrations could be quite different. In addition to that, we talked about the difference between subcultures and countercultures. So, subcultures were those cultures where there are distinct norms, values, etc., that help define that culture. And these could be based on things such as religion, ethnicity, um, perhaps political beliefs, whereas a counterculture are groups that oppose or reject the dominant culture's norms and values. So examples of countercultures might be, for instance, when we saw the civil rights movement pick up, or, of course, my favorite, the hippie culture, when there were protests against what was believed to be a person's right to peacefully exist. From there, we talked about cultural change and how things or entities such as the mass media could impact change, and then also the reasons for change. So we reviewed or discussed the definitions between diffusion, invention, innovation, and discovery. We also talked about the cultural lag that can happen when change happens. So, how society could change, but our belief systems may not keep pace with that. We wrapped up chapter 3 with examining just a little bit the various sociological perspectives around culture, and we reviewed how the functionalism, conflict, feminist, and symbolic interaction theories all help to explain various aspects of cultural change within our societies. So that wraps up chapter 3, and let's move into the discussion for chapter 4. Chapter 4, we began our conversation regarding socialization around the nature versus nurture debate. And we talked about how both are needed for an individual to become a functioning member of society. In the biological scientific world, this conversation is also known as G versus E, genetics versus environment. So, to what percent can we attribute genetics and what percent can we attribute to our environment regarding the development of a human being? As we know, we ended that conversation with talking about how you really needed both, and we used the examples of David and then also the wild child, quote unquote, wild child Ginny, where for David, there were conflictive information regarding what he knew about his natural biology. And for Ginny, she didn't have that nurturing component. And we can see that both situations ended in disastrous effects. So we know that we need both of those things, but when it comes to socialization, what the science has strongly suggested to us is that it's just slightly more important that people have that nurturing effect or that environmental support in order to be contributing, functioning members within their communities. We then talked about one of my favorite topics, which is the agents of socialization, and how parents and family, siblings all work to help you begin to figure out who you are and how you should act while you are growing as a person. We also talked about the impact of peers and friends that can have on a person's development throughout life, and how that is expanded when they get to the educational environment, and how teachers, principals, other persons of authority, and different social situations can impact a person's development. And finally, we talked about, in fact, we ended class with how media can impact our perceptions of things and how we learn to do things, like how we learn to do gender. And of course, media is this broad umbrella that impacts us in a variety of ways. So it helps shape the type of music we listen to and the type of television we watch. In addition to that, it impacts how we respond to those things. So if we're looking at gender, how does a male respond to a quote unquote chick flick? How does a female respond to an action film? All of these agents of socialization come together to create this force that begins to build our self-awareness. For instance, we talked about Cooley's theory behind the looking glass self and how we develop not just our awareness of self and our own identity, but then how other people see us. And we talked about Mead's theory behind the development of self and role taking and how we differentiate between the me and the I. One is again, how we view ourselves, and the other is how we perform on stage, which dovetailed nicely into the final theory that we talked about, which is Goffman's impression management, right? So we're always on this stage, and how do we present ourselves? What are the mannerisms that we engage in so that we can always put our best foot forward in efforts to have positive feedback about who we are as individuals? Now, one thing we didn't get to talk about a whole lot was socialization across the lifespan, and who we are as individuals changes as we go through life. So who we are as a child and a toddler, while some of those things are created very early and in fact can sometimes be argued are virtually cemented by the time we're 3 years old, they actually change as we start to engage with these different agents of socialization. So as we get to adolescence and we start testing our boundaries with those people who are authority figures in our life, that changes with who we become as a young adult, and we start taking on different roles such as an employee or a partner in a romantic relationship. And it changes yet again when we get into later life, after perhaps we've had a family or we've had a couple different career changes, and now we're ready for retirement. And of course, other things come in to impact who we are, right, as we develop throughout our lifespan. So what does our health look like? What does our access to education look like? Have we engaged at all in either a positive or a negative way with things like the criminal justice system? All of these help us to socialize and re-socialize throughout the lifespan. The other thing we really didn't get to talk about a whole lot was this concept of resocialization in total institutions. So resocialization is this concept where we unlearn things that we had learned earlier in our life, and we adopt new behaviors, new values, new norms so that we can fit better into our current environment. We sometimes do this by choice, and sometimes it's forced upon us. So one example of resocialization is when you have to go to prison. If someone is caught engaging in some sort of illegal activity, when they get to prison, they are intentionally stripped of all of their personal possessions. They all wear the same uniform. As an inmate, they are assigned a number. They become known as inmate number XYZ. Very rarely is their name used, and so this identity is kind of stripped away so that they can become part of this larger institution that isolates them from society overall. Another example of this is when a person joins the military. They are again stripped away of their personal identity and kind of broken down so they can be built back up to conform to this new institution. It's yet another way to re-socialize a person. Okay, so that was chapters 3 and 4. Next week, we're going to start our group presentation. So groups 1 and 2 are going to talk about social structure and social interaction. I'm going to go in and supplement that material after the presentations are complete. I'm really looking forward to that. I'm excited to see how you all interpret this information. And I guess that's it for now. So I'll see you all on Tuesday.